Welcome everyone to another DevOps.com webinar. We have a very interesting topic today and a panel discussion to discuss it with an interesting group of people. Today we're going to discuss the evolution of continuous delivery. Continuous delivery has been one of the first initiatives of DevOps from the very beginning. So it's always been talked about, always part of the mainstream within DevOps. Today we're going to talk about how it's evolving to continuous deployment. It's really a very interesting topic, and you see how the whole DevOps evolution is happening through this one instance. Today, we have three different panelists that are very interesting and very educated on the topic. The first is Christian. He's a solution engineer with GitHub, and we'll talk more about GitHub and the Microsoft later. Next is Tracy Ragan, CEO of DeployHub. A lot of expertise, been around this industry as long as it's been around like me. And David Federlein, Senior Product Manager, RedHat Ansible. And with that, let me tell you about a few things. If you have questions, just type them in and we'll get to them. If you have any problems, just type them in the question and we'll get to them. So with that, welcome everyone.
Howdy.
Thank you.
With that, let's get started. Let me start with David Federlein, if you don't mind, David. How do organizations who haven't moved to continuous automation models approach adoption of DevOps?
By putting one foot in front of the other. No, not to be glib about it, but so this is one of the things. Actually, I get this every day because I sit down with customers who are I don't want to say this in a disparaging way, but late to the game, right? These are late adopters, and they generally have a lot of questions, and they sit down and they say, how do we get this done? And the first answer is always, you have institutional problems in such that your teams have dysfunction. All large teams, all large organizations have this. You deal with your dysfunction first, because the mistake happens, and what happens when we see with people cargo culting process is that they're not going to deal with the process. They mistake the tool for the process. And I cringe every time I hear someone say, well, we've implemented Chef, so we're doing DevOps. And I'm like, well, those are two different statements, and they don't necessarily relate to each other, right? And so the issue that I'd like to sit down and say is, how are you trying to accomplish what you're doing? Are you trying to check a box and say we do this and we are, agile and adhering to DevOps, or are you trying to speed up your best practices in change control by embedding, knowledge across disparate teams, by templating the best practices and allowing each other teams to use tools to do so, and tying them together with automation. And that process really is the beginning of getting to having a CI/CD pipeline that is useful. Otherwise, you're basically decreeing things from the top down, and doing so does not mean that the adoption will be easy or followed by those who are actually working on this boots on the ground.
Well, David, do you think people are doing it, don't know they're doing it?
I think there are people who might not understand that they are already practicing aspects of DevOps and not realizing it, right? And this might actually come back to the fact that our marketing is damaging to the description of what DevOps is. And when I say our, I mean the industries. And I actually liken that back to, if you remember, like we had this thing called the cloud. It was a great way to describe how to elastically assign resources on grid computing. And then a certain hard drive manufacturer comes out with a USB hard drive and calls it a personal cloud, and suddenly cloud is a useless term, right? Yeah. And we're very close to that happening with DevOps, especially now that people are tacking things onto it, like NetSec DevOps, where I don't want to dilute what we're talking about by arguing about tools and or silos. What I want to talk about is the process by which we are not only embedding our knowledge, but also automating our best practices so that each of us can use it together, right?
And you're right, because DevSecOps, Dev products, they're all coming around. Everybody's using all the different terms, and it all runs together. But let me move on a little bit, because this is the foundation of the beginning of really where we are at the webinar. Tracy, I have a question for you. How is continuous delivery different from continuous deployment?
Well, can be a loaded question, but it really isn't. It's pretty simple. So continuous delivery is generally a process, and that process involves a release candidate. So the idea of continuous delivery is that you, at any point in time in your life cycle or in your pipeline, your CD pipeline, you have the ability to do a release. So continuous delivery manages a release candidate, and it does many other things, but for this discussion, we'll just keep it at that. Think of it as having a release candidate ready for staging. Now, in a simple world, you can use continuous delivery to move out a jar file or a WAR file. But in the bigger picture, you may have more pieces and parts that you need to manage. And without the ability to actually move these bigger pieces and parts out to all of the endpoints, including production, you begin going back into, you kind of slip back into waterfall, where development teams are running their continuous delivery and they're pushing out their jar file and doing things on a really iterative basis, but production isn't necessarily iterative. So continuous deployment is the maturing of the continuous delivery model to support doing those releases to any endpoints in any environment. And as we move into what we would call a digital transformation or DevOps, where we're moving into containers and microservices, the ability to do continuous deployments become more critical. It doesn't take away from the continuous delivery engine that's running, but it adds a level of maturity required to do iterative releases without having to carry a script that's doing something monolithic. And that release should include database updates, infrastructure, configuration management changes. All of those pieces and parts need to be moved together, and that's what continuous deployment is doing.
That is a great answer, Tracy. It brings it all together very quickly. But now Christian, I have to come to you. This is the answer this is a question why really everybody came on this webinar. What does the acquisition of Microsoft mean for the users of GitHub? Are they going to have to give up their apples?
Absolutely not. So I'll give you I knew the question was coming, but I'll give you two responses, right? So I think the first response I'll give you is that as an individual contributor to Microsoft to GitHub, I think it's business as usual. So what we've been told is that Microsoft plans to keep GitHub completely independent of the Microsoft mothership, and they want to continue funding us. And really, they enjoy what we're doing with the open source community, and they want to be able to help curate that community and help grow that community. Now, my personal opinion, when I first heard of the news, I essentially came with a sense of cautious optimism, because I think there's two ways that we can sort of view this acquisition, right? If we think about the Microsoft of 20 years ago and their approach to not only Linux, but in terms of the way that they approached the open source community, by some comments from former CEOs that you can certainly Google yourself, there could be a sense of that Microsoft is really just trying to acquire to really take over our customer base, our community base. So if we take our opinion from there, it can be very frightening and very scary. From the last 10 years in which Satya Nadella has taken over as CEO of Microsoft, and the openness that they've taken to the open source community, and the fact that they are now the largest contributor of open source software on GitHub.com today, I think there is a sense of optimism, because I think for the first time that we've seen over the last several years, Microsoft is finally getting it in terms of how they want to be able to take care of the open source development community. So I take it from with a sense of cautious optimism. I'm really excited. I think this will allow us to grow as an organization for years and years on out. A lot of what I do at GitHub is thinking about ways that we can affect generational change within the software development community and the tools that are around that ecosystem. And I think having sort of parents like Microsoft that'll take care of us and fund us will allow us to really think about sort of the messaging that we can go forward with for the long term. So I will say that we'll take it from that sort of sense of optimism. I will say if we come into a situation where Clippy starts showing up on our pull requests and starts getting us off the walls recommendations, then probably it's not the right move, right? But I don't think Microsoft is going to do anything like that, and I'm pretty excited.
Are you kidding me? If Clippy showed up in GitHub, I would do everything in GitHub. but actually, on that point, I do want to say there's look, I am of the generation in which I came up cutting my teeth on Linux when Microsoft was saying these things publicly that everyone is now dreading, right? But I also worked for a company Red Hat that has a partnership to run OpenShift on Azure, right? There are a lot of ways that Microsoft has not only changed over the years, but has encouraged and become part of the open source community for better or worse. And I don't think that approaching anything with a sense of dread is going to accomplish anything, because I honestly don't think that there is a nefarious reason for an acquisition in terms of open source having a safe place in the world, right? Microsoft didn't do this to destroy and extend in the way that we remember from 25 years ago, right? This is not the same world anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of the partnerships that I work on from a cloud perspective also include AWS and GCP. I actually hosted a Dev Day Summit in Chicago yesterday. So our partnerships with cloud organizations are not going to change. So one of the things that we've also talked about in the not only internally to GitHub, but within the external community is, is this acquisition going to mean that we're going to provide a Microsoft first narrative around like developing code and sharing code and deploying code to GitHub, right? The answer from what I know so far is no. From the roadmap that I've seen and helped contribute to, a lot of what we want to do in terms of the cloud, in terms of cloud providers, is to remain neutral. We don't necessarily want to take a specific opinion with GitHub in terms of not only the developer tools that you're choosing, but also the cloud service providers you're choosing. Because the moment we do that is the moment that we take away power from the individual developer to be able to choose the best of breed tooling that they want to use.
Mm-hmm. Well, David, what message is being missed or diluted by marketing materials referencing DevOps as opposed to the original intent of the term? Let's jump to there from the Microsoft.
Well, okay, so again, and this might be a natural evolution of a movement, quote unquote, within tech, but I've had conversations where people say things like, well, I'm thinking about, starting some DevOps initiatives. What do you think of tool X? And I think what's missed here is that not only, look, I'm not here to, well, I do have some opinion on what tool you should use, but it's not going to be the opinion everyone thinks it is. My opinion is here. There are a vast array of things that I can walk out into my garage and work on my car with, okay? But all of them can also fit on, mostly, 2 or 3 ends of a keychain, right? I used to drive a Jeep Wrangler, and I could pretty much take that thing apart with a wrench and 3 screwdrivers. But the thing about that is that me having that wrench and 3 screwdrivers doesn't mean that I'm not going to need a Makita, or I'm not going to need a hammer, or I'm not going to need something else. And what we're really missing here is that everyone's marketing in this industry is talking about how the tool is DevOps. And we need to stop that, because a specific tool is not DevOps. Look, the earliest adoption story that we can tell at Ansible, and is still a very popular one today, is that people will adopt Ansible so that they can deploy Puppet out on their systems that are controlled by Puppet. That's not a competition, right? That is a complement of 2 tools that work together, right?
It's not an either or.
Right. And I think what we're really getting into is a time where we need to be careful to sit down and say, look, we need to talk about process and help people do things rather than get into an argument as to whether or not you want to use VI versus Emacs.
Right. And Tracy, I need you to weigh in. Are there also messages being missed or diluted by marketing that references continued deployment, like there are with DevOps?
I think it's the marketing material out there can be extremely confusing. Even crossing over into, for example, I had a recent email discussion with somebody, and there was a reference to Docker being a deployment tool. Now we know that Docker is not a deployment tool, but we also know there's a lot of information about deploying to Docker. So these topics, when it comes to continuous delivery, when it comes to, we have so many terms. We have application release automation, we have continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, release automation. It can go on and on. So I believe that when I look at, if somebody asks me, have you heard about this tool? And I go, I read about it. They'll say, oh, well, Helm's the newest continuous deployment solution. It's like, you have to have an understanding of the market to really understand what some of these tools are doing, and to be able to push through the marketing material and to actually understand what the core of the product is. And I think to David's point, we have to stop saying that DevOps is a tool, because DevOps is never going to be a tool. There's going to be tools in the DevOps space, and they're all going to fit in a particular silo. But the messaging around it, almost every tool you look at in our market says it does deployments.
I actually think a lot of them are going to fit in multiple silos, and they're going to overlap each other, and that's fine.
Yes,
you know,
absolutely.
Like the tool is not the process, and the process is not the tool. And really, like, if you were just coming into IT and you've been in a coma since 2001, you would have no idea what any of these things do if you read about them, you know, and that's a problem, right? We really need to be better about how we solve a problem and not how you implement a tool.
Is that
exactly? And I think to that point.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think to that point, I think what the evolution is that the tools can help define and accelerate process, but really what you're after is the cultural change that'll occur in any organization that starts adopting not a DevOps process, but a DevOps mindset. And to me, that really kind of boils down to a mindset and a methodology that encourages collaboration and transparency within the whole software development lifecycle from idea to delivery. Because the only way that we write better code is actually getting more people involved with the process that are stakeholders from idea to production.
And those processes, we're going to be watching over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. Processes change drastically due to microservices. Microservices is going to have a heavy impact on how we currently manage software releases, software development. I mean, for example, I pose this question often. If you're doing microservice development, do you have a Jenkins workflow for every microservice? Do you have a Git repository for every microservice? We have to break down deployments into its iterative pieces and no longer do things monolithic. And we have to be able to more tightly control what's in those all those tiny little containers that we're managing out in these big Kubernetes clusters and pods. So this is a good discussion to have now, because the more we talk about it now, the better able people will be to get there. So in other words, if we have a set of tools, to give David's example of working on his Jeep Wrangler, that might work for the Jeep Wrangler today, but as he pointed out, there may be other tools he needs to do other things. We're at that point. We're going to have other tooling to do other things to support microservices. And that's the whole world of DevOps in my mind.
And you're right. DevOps, you know, I've seen it over the years, been a part of it. Obviously, we have DevOps.com. There's two aspects. DevOps does have a whole lot of tools out there, but it's a whole mindset, process, and philosophy you have to buy into, that you're open-minded, you're going to embrace new things. And it says, really, I put this out to everybody. Now, we have to get past these tooling debates as to which tool is better or worse, and more meaningfully talk about the process. How do we do that?
Well, honestly, we do that by not, you do that by not marketing from the top down. Traditionally in IT, sales and marketing has happened at the management level, okay? But the thing that's different about the way Ansible success story curves, and by the way, a lot of the modern tool set, not just Ansible, has gone, is that the people on the ground found it useful, began to create processes with the tool, began to automate, began to include other teams, and then exported their success across the organization. And I think that is the way that approaching fundamental change in discussion, particularly for marketing, is going to happen. You're not going to do this by continuing to have golf with a C-level person and talk about how we do DevOps and here's my stack. Who cares? I don't even care what they do on the golf course, right? But stop selling software there. Start actually creating something that people on the ground can functionally use, integrate with the other things they're already using, and then export that success across their organization. Once you start there, then we're not marketing from the top down, and then we're not talking in abstract. We're talking about things that are real that you can change.
Right. I think, David, to your point, I think Kelsey Hightower last year said that DevOps is group therapy for sysadmins, right? And I know it's a little bit of a joke, right? But there's a lot of truth into that statement. And we can drop sysadmins from the title because I think it's actually group therapy for anybody that's involved in the software development lifecycle. And what I mean by that, I think a fundamental shift in the way that you approach digital transformation and DevOps adoption is that we have to have a level of empathy for anybody that's involved in the process so that we involve and we understand each other's pain about why we are shifting into this sort of mindset. And I think that does not, I think that doesn't come from the top down. I think, like you said, it comes from the folks that are on the ground that are dealing with these pains on a daily basis. Things like bugs being found in production at 3 o'clock in the morning, forcing that on-call rotation, forcing that person to wake up in the middle of the night to resolve that. Things like having to deal with dependency hell, right? Understanding those pains, that's where you start seeing the shift of mindset being able to not force, but allow for that kind of adoption to happen.
And those, yeah, and I think,
and that shift is not going to come from the golf course. I mean, David and Christian are absolutely spot on. I call it the dysfunction in our family. When we see companies going out and still spending, $800,000, $1 million on a single tool to do a single step in the CI/CD process, we know it didn't come from the developers. We know the developers struggle with those kinds of that level of automation, but they have in that selling mode and the marketing mode up into the C level, the real solutions that the development teams want are not addressed. And so what happens is you get these big purchases at high cost and high risk, and then that is they try to force that down to the development teams as a overall solution. The solution is going to solve all their problems, and it really only creates more for them. So the more that we find solutions and workflows and process built out at the lower teams, and the more we can provide affordable automation to project teams, the better that conversation is going to be, because that team's going to have success, and then they can build upon that success, tweak it as they need to for another team if that needs to be, and grow it from the ground as opposed to trying to bring it in from the top. That has never worked, and we continue to see big companies selling that way, but it doesn't work. It's not agile, it's waterfall.
And I'm going to tell you that the big companies selling that way probably isn't going to go away, because as you grow as an organization selling software, you want everyone to adopt your software across everything in the data center. And the reality is, as someone who came from ops myself, you will never get a completely homogeneous data center ever. And even if it's cloud, like, it doesn't matter. Like, you're not going to be running only a certain type of Linux for absolutely everything you're doing within cloud. All of these things are going to have to be homogeneous, they're going to have to work together, and they're going to have to be geared towards allowing people who are actually doing the work to get it done easier.
So then it begs a question. We got two things going on here. We got barriers and the best place to start. Now, we're talking about continuous deployment. Tracy, what do you think, what barriers will people have to overcome, and what's the best way to approach it to get started?
Well, as a follow-up to the previous question, one of the barriers for continuous deployment is for development teams to get their hands on affordable solutions for continuous deployment. If you're a project team, you don't have $500,000 to go and spend on a release automation solution, right? You have a small budget. So one of the barriers is the way in which these products are sold, as a follow-up to the previous discussion. Another barrier that I see, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but I'm going to do it anyways, is that oftentimes development teams hang on really tightly to their scripts. It sort of reminds me of a Zen story about the Zen master, and the person came to the Zen master and he was holding a big thorny ball of twine and bushes. And he said, "Zen master, I'm so in so much pain, I just don't know what to do." And the Zen master looked at him and he said, "Do this." And he raised his hands up in the air. And the person raised his hands up in the air really quick and then reached down and picked up his thorny ball again. So at some point, we have to recognize that when we talk about automation, we talk about continuous delivery, We've done a lot in terms of automation, right? We have automated tests. There's a lot that's being done in automation, but there's also a lot that's still scripted, and those scripts are a throwback from the waterfall approach. So development teams have to have not only the ability to get their hands on automation, but they also have to recognize the benefits of that automation. That it may not be that their script is adaptable across a pipeline, that their script produces the insight needed to go faster. So there's a cultural shift that is a barrier to really achieving and maturing out that continuous delivery pipeline when we begin believing that we can do everything with scripts. Automation is going to be required.
I think there's 100%. A corollary to that. Go ahead, Christian.
Oh, no, go ahead, David. I'll chime in after you.
Sure. I think there's a corollary to that. I think that the mistake is that automation is for one person to do one thing that they know how to do, and then we're going to template that across everyone else's thing. And the problem is the approach. You're not automating so that you can do one thing. You're automating so that other people can do your job by best practices. And so functionally, if you approach this in such a way where you say, here is my best practices in a template form. And yes, this is a horrible Perl script that nobody can read but me. Right, or whatever the problem is that won't fit when you template that somewhere else, then functionally other teams are going to come and say, hey, listen, I love the fact that I can run your automation for what you do and put it into my workflow, but I can't adapt what you're doing all across the board. Can we sit down and figure out how to do that? And I think the collaborative aspect of that, when you realize that you're creating something so someone else can do your job in their pipeline, then the collaborative aspect of is my script really good, starts to show how you change that for, working with other people. And functionally, this is the talk I give all the time with Ansible, right? You can do your own thing, and then you can export that success simply by saying to someone else, please use this and do my job for me. And then when they say, I would like to do this also, you can say, this is how I did it. Does it work for you? How doesn't it? How can we change this so that it works for everyone?
I think it's
Christian?
changing the fun of, yeah, I think David was exactly spot on. I think what we're thinking about here in terms of this sort of methodology and the shift is a change in the economic model of how we view knowledge transfer across organizations, and then the value of knowledge to the individual contributor to the greater organization as a whole. What the DevOps shift is doing and what the open source community is doing and what enterprises are beginning to adopt is the value of the individual contributors' tribal knowledge in their organization is being decreased substantially. And that's actually a good thing for the organization as a whole, because if we have this idea and this mindset that we're going to decrease the amount of knowledge that I'm holding on for my own economic benefit within the organization, once I start decreasing that value, two things happen. One, information can start flowing to the rest of the organization. And from an enterprise standpoint or an enterprise organization standpoint, I can start finding faults and I can start finding positive knowledge within that organization on where I'm doing things really well and where I'm doing things maybe not so well. For the individual contributor, what it means is that I can stop holding on to this individual skill set that may be holding back my entire sort of technical knowledge and expertise and the things that I know about. Once we start thinking about that and the benefit that we can do from that, or that we can gain from that, that's where we start seeing that shift of context. Because I think a lot of what I see in enterprise organizations that are adopting not only GitHub, but sort of a lot of tools around around this ecosystem is that the context of what it actually means to be a software developer is completely changing. A lot of times when we think about traditional waterfall practices, a developer doesn't necessarily get much say or visibility into the ideas that are being written up as a spec for them to code to. Now, what we're seeing in a DevOps mindset is that the developers themselves are actually becoming key stakeholders as part of this innovation process. So what that means is we are now actually building similar to what the open source community has done, in that we are building communities within software development organizations. And so I think what's happening is now you're starting to improve not only the personal experience of the individual developer, but as an enterprise organization, it's a benefit of cost to you as well, because not only are you able to hold on to that developer for a little bit longer, you're able to use their skill set in many different ways.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's perfectly summed up, at least in my brain, as an example of what functionally and culturally we have done in enterprise IT for 35 years, and that's become siloed and experts and functionally gatekeepers. And what we're really looking at is a shift from gatekeeping to cooperative enablement.
100%. And that's not to say that let's think about the real world scenario, because in some organizations you will need to have some of those gatekeeping scenarios. You know, if I'm a financial services organization, or if I'm a federal organization that has very strict regulatory and compliance reasons that I need to have some sort of gatekeeping or some collaboration, some sort of like silo of that lacks collaboration, we can still adopt those legal and compliant reasons as part of your software development lifecycle. But more often than not, when we talk to a lot of enterprise organizations undergoing this shift, the silos that inhibit collaboration are only there for culturally defined reasons that no one can necessarily provide a less than opaque answer to, meaning that we just have reasons why we don't collaborate. When we actually strip it away, usually the reasons, the legal and compliance reasons that we don't collaborate across repositories and across code bases tend to be very limited in scope.
Right.
Well, that's true. I have that conversation every day, particularly with industries that have not just banking and government, but like medical, HIPAA, things like that. And the conversation is generally, what functionally do you need to comply and work within the boundaries that is set for your organization. And oftentimes simply templating best practices and having a controlled way in which other teams can use that template is good enough. And it should be good enough, because that's honestly where we should have been 30 years ago.
Exactly. We used to call it, and I still do with some customers, a compliance template. Yep. So if your development teams understand the compliance levels that they need to reach, they will get there. And the reality is that even though Agile is something that people have adopted in a very formal way, we've sort of been growing towards it for quite a long time. There are plenty of teams that are practicing old-fashioned waterfall that still have a main developer who is responsible for getting the builds done and for hand-holding the production team and getting the deployments done. That's morphing into roles like site reliability engineers that are squarely on the development side of the house, but are trusted partners to the operations side of the house. And when it comes to collaboration, there's no better mix, right? Because you have somebody who's on the team who understands the product, who understands the pieces and parts, can take responsibility for that site reliability, but the operations side of the house trusts them and collaborates with them and talks to them, and does that part of the role of supporting the infrastructure, but not getting in the way of development teams to get their applications out the door and get innovation to end users as quick as possible, which is the goal of all of this.
Yeah, and I think it's that shift left mentality, right, that a lot of people talk about, or what people are calling DevSecOps now, which is an okay title. It's not my favorite, but at the end of the day, what we're talking about in terms of compliance and policy is putting that as part of your software development process at the time of something like on GitHub at the time of the pull request, right? So there's a lot of talk around like DevSecOps, and I think at the end of the day, all it is compliance as code and policy as code, leading into governance as code. So rather than having your security team be the choke point in terms of a continuous delivery or just a delivery model, we're going to actually put them as part of the software development process. So not only can they contribute, but they can also give best practice to the developer who's never necessarily had to think about security and compliance before.
And then automation can help do those checks. You don't have to have a human doing it. You can use automation 100%. Tools as output. Yeah, and then we have something, right? We have something that's moving faster, that's auditable, that you have visibility into, that can be reported on. That if somebody goes on vacation, suddenly nobody understands how to run the script if it breaks. So we're getting there, and continuous deployment does it, and DevOps is the broader conversation. Now, what I'm starting to see, we have some smaller companies in our local area that we're getting better exposure to how microservices and these Kubernetes environments are going to really look. I think what I find interesting about those environments is that we start losing the real pipeline kind of dev test prod. what you end up with is end users. And end users are going to use a combination of microservices that represent tests, and those end users' roles might be testers, or they might be actual software end users, the end customer. But we get away from having, this idea that we all were raised around where we had a set of servers underneath our developer desk, and then we had a test lab that had a set of servers, and now we have a production that has a set of servers. Microservice really kind of blows all that away, because you could have microservices that are a combination of production components and that production end users are hitting, and another one that test users are hitting, that make up that broader monolithic looking application. So it's going to change. It's going to look very different in terms of how we're going to move forward in this journey.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Tracy, now we've talked about a lot of templates, a lot of things that relate to continuous deployment. What's something simple, like a simple template, a blueprint or something? How can people get started easily without being overwhelmed?
Well, there's so much out there already on just getting started. I would say the template that most companies, if they haven't already really bit down on continuous integration, the template needs to be about speed. And speed starts with understanding how to run a build as quickly as possible, get the build down to that 10 minutes. That's part of that blueprint that we have talked about for quite a long time now. And not all companies are still able to achieve that, but that's sort of square one for continuous integration. The whole idea was to get your builds where if somebody broke it, it could be fixed for the purpose of that staging a release candidate on a very high frequency basis. So that's the first step. The second step would be to look at testing and how can your testing pieces be automated. Underneath all that, though, you have to have an infrastructure. So how can you automate and package together the pieces and parts of your software package that you're going to be pushing after it's built into your test environment and be able to repeat that into production? So when you're looking at defining a blueprint for doing DevOps, I think you have to begin at the build and you have to think about ending at the deployment, but there's quite a few pieces in between there. And the automation of the infrastructure, automation of the software release, and automation of the testing are all part of that. And the better you do at getting that done, and the more incremental or more iterative you can perform in terms of getting a build done and getting a release out, the more ready you're going to be for those microservices, because microservices is a decomposed environment. You are not going to have these monolithic builds where everything gets compiled every single time, everything gets tested every single time, and everything gets released every single time. You're going to be doing that in pieces and parts.
Actually go backwards on that. So when I have that conversation with a customer, generally they're not necessarily smaller companies, they're larger companies, and they're just like, we want to do this, but we still sit down in a cab every week, right? And my response to them is always the actual opposite of that. It's, hey, you remember 5 years ago when everyone was talking about how you need to come up with infrastructure as a service? And they go, yeah. And I go, so what'd you do with that? Well, we implemented this, that, or the other thing, but now we have the ability to easily deploy infrastructure. And I said, great. Infrastructure as a service is absolutely useless without the platform on top of it. So why don't you just automate the rest of it?
Yeah, and I think it comes down to 3 pillars, right? We want to have software that is quality, and 2 pillars. We want to have software that is been run through the ringer with quality. We want to automate a lot of those processes, and we want to talk about collaboration as well. So I think, in terms of like a simple blueprint, I think we think about it from those high-level pillars, right? We don't necessarily get into the nitty-gritty of the individual tools, because at the end of the day, every organization is going to figure out which tools give them the best user experience. We certainly have some opinions around that, but it's really about the flexibility of allowing not only developer freedom, but also developer choice to be able to say, this tool is going to provide me the most user experience to allow me to be the most efficient person that I can be. So I think from a high level, we think about the tools that will allow collaboration. We'll think about the tools that allow for great quality and great automation as well. I think from there, that's a blueprint that you can start moving into in terms of then evaluating tools around project management, source code management, delivery automation, deployment automation, and then you can use that as a baseline to begin evaluating the tools that sort of kind of work within there, because then you can start looking at things like the chart from like the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which looks like a big mess if you ever look at it without a sort of an opinionated eye. Once you start thinking about in terms of what you want to do in terms of delivering software, that's where you can begin making better choices around your tool stack.
Well, and there's a lot of great examples on GitHub on how to do that. You know, like for example, there's the people that come to us and say, I don't really know how to automate my testing. I could say, why don't you just go look at the Ansible repo? And yeah, I'm tooting my own horn here, and you know, take that with a grain of salt. But you know, 99% of code quality issues that Ansible needs when we accept stuff is automated. Like from when the community, you know, commits, all the code quality concerns that we have generally are caught 99% of the time in automated testing. And that's a good start. Now, what you do after that and how you tie that in to infrastructure after that in an automated fashion might be a more opinionated and a more specific topic for customers. But I do think that there is value in moving a lot of your work out of you know, local stuff on local networks that are only available on VPNs for work, and starting to actually move to an open source model.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's moving away from that development process of, as soon as it works on my machine, I have a pull request that merges back into the master, right? It's doing the minimum amount of work in your individual local development environment and then opening up that conversation for collaboration. Because just because it, you know, the old adage of just because it works on my machine means everything is fine has completely been thrown out the window in this sort of new mindset. So we want to get everybody on board, and we want to be able to get everybody into the conversation as soon as possible. So real quickly, tactically, one of the things that we encourage all of our customers at GitHub when they're talking about sort of like a DevOps methodology that's centered around the GitHub pull request is that when a developer is working on a change request in their local environment, on their very first commit, they should be pushing that change up to GitHub, opening up a pull request, and CCing their team. Because even though I can continue that work locally in my environment, what I want at the end of the day is to get credence from my team that I'm working on the right thing in the best way possible that my team has decided as a best practice. Doing that also builds that trust and transparency that we are all open to new ideas within our process, and that we are open to intaking those ideas.
That's great. It's been a very great discussion. Now, we talked about the what if, you know, how to sort of approach this. Now, the big question, what happens, and I'll start this with you, Tracy. What is the risk? What happens to organizations if they don't adopt continuous automation practices and DevOps in general?
Well, you know, at a high level, it's everything that we do in Agile and in DevOps is not really about us, but it's about who we're serving. And we're serving a customer. And customers have, you know, and I'm a customer. I've gotten to the point where if something's broken, I want it fixed right now, right? How fast can we get new innovation, new fixes down to the end user? I want it on my phone right now. I get irritated when my phone has to do an update to fix something. I just want it to magically happen. So if the risk of not embracing these new practices, the risk of not doing Agile is that you lose market share ultimately. You're not serving your customer. You're not putting your customer first. And if you're truly putting your customer first, you're going to want to embrace these kinds of technologies. You're going to want to embrace continuous deployment. You're going to want to embrace automation at the infrastructure level. All of these practices are all about serving our customer better. So don't take a risk of not serving your customer better because they'll go somewhere else. And that is the truth. We've all done it.
I'm not going to disagree with that, but I'm going to point something out. For a very small subset of people going into the world right now, fresh with their CS degree out of college, they can still go get a career in COBOL. And I'm going to say this, there will never not be a place for old tech in the industry. But it won't be something that the majority of people will be working on. It'll be very specialized, it'll be a very small community, and it'll probably be marginalized.
You're right, David, especially Fortran and COBOL in the mainframe environment within the banking industry. There's a great example.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I think
you
even
can
then,
still get a job doing that, but why would you?
Well,
yeah, and I would say even with that, what I've seen is, in terms of like mainframe deployment, a lot of these organizations, and there are a lot of companies out there that are trying to figure out and solve that problem of how do I bring sort of that modern methodology into a framework like COBOL or Fortran. And there are ways that, this is a discussion for another day, but I think even in the future, as we figure out what those processes are, we're going to be able to figure out a way to think about what it means for legacy technology to be able to adopt a more continuous mindset.
And
it happens now.
Yeah.
Like containers allows us to do a lot of this, right? Because that technology is so old and the dependency tree is so known, we could template best practice container for those things and move it to the cloud, and it happens. It's happened in the past, it's happened now, and it will continue to happen as these legacy programs continue to run without anybody that really can, rewrite them in something better.
Right, and
right,
IBM
exactly, because the technology is going to outlast the people, right? And so we need to figure out when the last, Oracle development expert moves on, then how are we going to be able to train up the next person that's going to be able to do that, right?
Mm-hmm. And IBM and others, IBM's opening up their mainframe. They've had containers forever. It all will come together. It all will. It's just a question of time, and it's going to be interesting to watch. I think that's about all the time for the discussion. Now let's try to take a couple questions. Does anybody, before I go to questions, anybody want to add anything?
No, I think just the last thing I was going to say in terms of the question on risk, without selling FUD, I think what we're really thinking about is delivering better software and enabling our people, and the risk of not adopting a mindset and a methodology that's being adopted by the industry allows for a level of lack of innovation and a lack of individual contributor retention, right? I feel that in my opinion, those are the two biggest risks that enterprise organizations are going to take if they don't necessarily get on board with what their developers want to do and how they want to deliver software.
I'm going to sidestep risk. I'm just going to say that your end product will be better if you enable collaboration, period.
Mm-hmm.
That puts a point on it.
Yeah, it does. It's a perfect way to end that and go into questions. And I just want to let everybody know the slides and the whole webinar are available for replay on DevOps.com. We would give us 24 hours and we'll have it up for you. And we also can give you any of the contact information of any of the speakers you want. Okay, let's start with the first question. We use Jenkins to do deployments. How is that different from continuous deployment? Tracy?
So as I was discussing earlier, marketing can be confusing, and the way we talk about things can be confusing. Jenkins is an orchestration tool. It itself doesn't do anything. You have an unsung hero who has written some Perl scripts or Python scripts or some kind of a script that's actually doing the deployment that Jenkins is calling to have the work done. So I hear this question often because that unsung hero might be sitting is busy working all the time, and you don't get a lot of interfacing with him. You just interface with Jenkins, but that unsung hero is the person who's actually doing a form of a deployment that comes from what we used to do in the waterfall days. And that doesn't always work because when you don't have the luxury of time to keep tweaking those scripts, you end up with your Jenkins workflow having some hiccups in it. So the goal here is to smooth out those hiccups, mature that continuous delivery pipeline, and to start automating those pieces. Not only that, you need the visibility, and if you're going to go fast, you need the visibility to know what you did.
And I think that visibility is a crucial, important point too, because I think a lot of developers, we suffer from a lack of context, right? So if we think about like building out a Jenkins pipeline where, Jenkins becomes sort of the orchestrator of our deployment and our delivery, a lot of times if we don't, I know this is hard to say, but like if we don't engineer it in the right way, what we can suffer from is a lack of visibility into that process. And we may not understand the project manager that may be involved in this process, or even the developer, may not be aware of what's happening through the entire pipeline chain. And the reason why we see that is we haven't chosen a canonical source of truth when it comes to collaboration. In my opinion, I'm biased, I work for GitHub. I think GitHub is the best place to sort of traverse all that information. So when we're talking to customers about building out pipelines, and we're talking to customers about building out a tool chain, theoretically what we need is we need a bunch of tools that have APIs and that can report back statuses to GitHub. What we found is in most cases, developers want all of that context within the scope of a change request, meaning that if I am using Jenkins for my continuous integration, I'm really more interested in the unit tests that are executing on Jenkins. I don't want to necessarily have to go into Jenkins itself and configure a delivery and a deployment pipeline from there. I want to be able to do that from GitHub itself. So that way I'm not necessarily moving into a linear motion. I am having a non-linear approach to my delivery cycle, and I have all of these tools reporting back the status. That way, and we've done this with the checks API, that way I don't have to go to one tool or many tools to figure out what the status is or what the process is so I can update my project manager. I have a unified view of all this collaboration in one place.
I think that's a great answer when you assume that there's already people involved in the process. I think that answer breaks down the second you bring on someone brand new, because no one has actually embedded their documentation people in the development process either. And that's one of the reasons why at Ansible we started very early with the docs team being embedded with the engineering team, and documentation changes and is iterated just as fast as the product is. And I think that part of this enablement isn't just the tool to do so, it's the ability to communicate, and that involves documentation.
100%. And that's actually something we do as an internal best practice at GitHub. So if you're contributing to the core product, GitHub/GitHub, that's our repository for the core product. If you have a change request that doesn't have not only a unit test, but corresponding documentation for the change that you're making, your pull request can't be merged. I mean, straight through, we have automation that's built into that process.
Mm-hmm.
And tooling can help documentation. I mean, not everything has to be just written in a Word doc. So, for example, with DeployHub, when you assemble your software package, you could be using an Ansible Galaxy role, and you could be pulling things from GitHub. That is self-documenting. So, in essence, what some of this tooling does for you is exposes the pieces and parts that generally you would have somebody who was sitting there and documenting would write down. So the more we can automate, even down to the documentation, the better off we are. Because
sure, but we're not actually touching on what I meant, and because the example in Ansible is, if you commit a module to Ansible and we bring it in, your documentation for that module is auto-generated from the code you're committing, okay? So that's one aspect. I'm talking about day one, not day two. If you have a contributor guide that is constantly updated to help people understand what it needs to look like, that is completely a game-changing moment. It's not just that you have the automation to tell people when they're wrong, it's that you've also embedded documentation to help tell people how to be right.
Correct. Agreed.
Mm-hmm. Now we have a lot of questions. I'm going to leave, we'll give to the panelists the more technical questions later that may apply, because we run out of time, may apply to specific instances. But I found this one was an interesting question for this panel in particular. How do you protect against people who want to hoard information and they think knowledge is power?
Wow, that
was a good one.
Yeah. Well, that comes to the culture, right? And I get that. I have seen that many, many times. And it gets back to, where I've seen it often is when you have somebody who has invested a lot in building out, let's say, some of the underlying scripts that support the building and the deploying of the application. I mean, this is where I work, so this is where I see this. They're pretty much invested in that. Their career is invested in it, and so it may feel like they're trying to hoard information, but really what they're doing is they're doing their job that they've done quite some time. I think that the more that we can educate those individuals that democratizing information and exposing what we do and cross training makes everybody better at their job. and it's good for the big all, not just for the small we. So somehow we have to democratize that data, and the best way to do that, to be quite honest, is with all these automation tools that are on the market right now. That's what they basically do. They're taking these processes that we used to do in waterfall. They're exposing how those pieces and parts are being put together. They're exposing what's being used, so that it's not just those individuals who are writing those scripts that understand what's going on. It totally does democratize the information.
Now, with that said, I think there's a layer. Go ahead, David, and I'll come in after you.
Well, I was going to say I'm going to add the community aspect to this. Like, when I see people hoarding information, what I see is people that have created something and don't want to participate in an open source process, which is what we're talking about here. And the reason why they don't is they might get told that they're really terrible at what they do, because they're intimidated by what might be perceived as a gruff community. And I think that if we can, have better community practices, and I can have the ability for people to feel safe in committing this stuff, then no one's going to come in and say that you're an idiot and throw a whole bunch of troll nastiness at people who are committing. And I'm not just talking about in open source. I'm talking about in an enterprise situation. You're doing this also on a microcosm level. If you can, head off a negative response to people who are uneducated, because the thing is with this is not skill set, it's education of process. And the way to feel comfortable and share your knowledge is to understand the community and process by which to do that is safe for you.
You're so right, David. I think this comes down to some hard questions and hard decisions that you have to make in an enterprise organization that's adopting a community mindset and a community model around your enterprise developers. In the open source community, it is really easy to decide when we do not want a contributor from into our community that is either from a core contributor standpoint or an outside contributor standpoint contributing back to us. We have the open source community has a somewhat easier time to decide when they do not want a contributor to be a part of that community, if they're being negative, if they're being nasty, if they're not contributing to a culture of knowledge sharing and empowerment. Because at the end of the day, knowledge is power, and that's not going to change. But what we're going to change is that the knowledge is not the power of the individual contributor. The knowledge and power, knowledge being powerful lies in being able to share to the rest of the community. So from an enterprise standpoint, we have to really think carefully, or enterprise organizations have to think carefully about not only the people that they're aligning to be sort of the core contributors, but also the people that are going to be collaboratively contributing to organizations and code bases as well. And that's really gonna cause us to think about how we're aligning people and people that are going to be part of our organization. And at the end of the day, those are difficult conversations that you have to have, whether or not you are comfortable with it or not. And does that mean maybe if we have a developer that has worked within an organization for several months and doesn't provide good behavior to the community, does that mean we align them to another team? It could be. Does it also mean coming to a decision where maybe they're not the best fit for the community model that I'm building, and we figure out what that next step is for them? That's my opinion.
Why, thank you. I have time. We have time for one more question. Tracy, I'm going to direct this one to you. I've heard a lot about GitHub and RedHat, obviously, over the years. How do I find out more information and get in contact with DeployHub?
Oh, well, that's a nice question to be asked. Just go to deployhub.com and the open source projects at deployhubproject.io.
All right, that's great. Well, I want to thank everybody. It was a very lively panel. Anybody have any final words?
Just thank you to my co-panelists. I enjoyed this. It was fun.
It was a great panel. Thank you for listening to another DevOps.com webinar. Everything will be available on, within 24 hours on our site, and we'll distribute, and we'll also be able to provide you any information about any of the speakers you want. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.